All right, so what does this mean then for postmodernism? One of the things I think is crucial here is to integrate the biographical dates of the leading postmodern thinkers. Postmodernism is a movement that sweeps certain parts of the humanities and the social sciences by the time we get into the third quarter of the 20th century, and then its educational implications start to be felt more significantly in the 1980s on through the 2000s and so forth. But what I want to do is now take the decade of the 1950s and argue that that's a key formative decade for many of the leading postmodern strategists. Now here the biography becomes important. If you take Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jean-Francois Lyotard, and I would add American postmodernist Richard Rorty, a striking fact is that by the time we get to the 1950s, all of these men are in their 20s and early 30s. That is to say, all of them were born in an interesting 7-year span from about 1926 or so to about 1931, right, or so. And what this then means is if they are born in that era, by the time we get to the 1950s, all of them are in their the key prime of their intellectual youth. That is to say, they are in graduate school, finishing up their graduate degrees, and launching themselves intellectually in their careers. And so what people think, decide, and strategize in their 20s and early 30s is absolutely crucial here. So what we have then is a group of people who we know from hindsight, right, became the leaders of the postmodern intellectual movement, born in the 1920s and early 1930s, coming of age intellectually in the 1950s. Now all four of those individuals, Foucault, Rorty, Lyotard, Derrida, striking thing is that all four of them got their PhD degrees in philosophy. So they're very well informed, philosophically speaking, and they're getting their degrees at very good institutions. And so they're up to speed on the latest issues in epistemology, metaphysics, right, and so forth. All of them are well versed on the epistemological issues, the neo-pragmatic skepticism, the failures of positivism and logical positivism in the United States. And so all of them, to one degree or another, are well versed in the kind of the skeptical trends and more relativistic epistemological trends that are going on in the philosophical world. And one of the things that we do know is characteristic of postmodernism is a kind of relativized skepticism, a skepticism about meta-narratives, about our ability to achieve truth, about the power of reason to come to know an independent world. And so all four of these individuals and then others are coming to believe by the time we get to the 1950s that this is our true epistemological predicament. Now the other thing though that is important here, and the point about the connection to Marxism, is that all four of those individuals and most of the other leading postmodernists are advocates of fairly far left politics. All of them are socialists in one degree or other, and three of the four, Derrida, Lyotard, and Foucault, were Marxists. Foucault was a member of the French Communist Party in the early 1950s. Derrida did not join the Communist Party, but he hung around and published in journals that were markedly communist friendly. Lyotard also was working with explicitly with Marxist groups. The American Richard Rorty is not a Marxist, but he's nonetheless a strong social democrat and kind of stakes out a position at the far end of the social democratic political spectrum as well. So the point then again is that we have not only four individuals who become leading strategists who are epistemologically well informed, getting their PhD degrees in philosophy from leading universities, but we also have four individuals who, as young men, are committed to strongly socialist analyses of societies, one being more social democratic, the other being much more explicitly Marxist in its orientation. So the argument then is going to be that I'm making is that the crises that are going on politically, right, in the classically Marxist model, right, of what's going to happen in the Soviet Union and the other leading countries and how things should be playing out in the United States and the leading capitalist nations, that this forms then a political crisis, and it's that politics and the crisis of a left way of thinking that's going on in the 1950s, and the need for a re-strategization, going along with realization epistemologically that reason isn't going to work, there is no such thing as truth, and so forth, that it's the marriage of those two, that skeptical, relativized epistemology rather, with a crisis, right, within a socialist political way of thinking that is going to give birth to postmodernism, right, as a movement. So what we should find then is over the course of the 1960s, as these leading figures establish themselves, and here I will cite before I mentioned Foucault, he becomes a big name by the time we get into the 1960s, late 1950s or 1960s. The same is going to be true with Derrida. He bursts onto the scene both in France and in the United States by the time we get to the mid to the late 1960s. Richard Rorty, right, in the United States becomes a big name in philosophy and social democratic thinking circles by the time we get 60s and on into the 70s. And the same is true with Jean-Francois Lyotard. He's the one who actually came up with the name postmodern. It comes from the Postmodern Condition, his book. The theme of being skeptical toward narratives, meta-narratives, rather, that also is a Lyotardian phrase here. So what we then have is all of these individuals establishing themselves as the leading strategists for postmodernism, how we're going to take the new epistemological themes and rework the political themes, and then this is what gets played out in education. We start to see by the time we get to the late 1970s on into the 1980s, and then for a generation still with us as we are in the early part of the 2000s now.